My name is Dr. Annette Bailey, and I currently teach at Ryerson University in the School of Nursing. By background, I'm a nurse. I'm also a public health practitioner, and that's why my research is focused on gun violence. It's focused specifically on gun violence survivorship and prevention. Communities need to be a part of the solution to gun violence. Communities are in themselves very resilient. They have resources, they may not be money kind of resources, but they are capacities and skills. They know their community best. They can create connections in community. And I think when we think about gun violence solutions, it shouldn't just focus on how much more police we need on the streets, right? It should be focused on who needs to be involved because of what the issue entails. And if this issue is very much affecting communities so much, and communities want to help, they want to help, they want to be engaged, they want to be mobilized. So why aren't we involving them? And I'm a public health practitioner. I've worked with public health for a very long time. And I see the issue of gun violence as a public health issue. That's what it is. Any issue that creates debilitating impacts on families and communities and a society is a public health issue, just like any other epidemic, right? So why don't we treat it like an epidemic?
Right.
Right? Because it is indeed an epidemic. Yeah. We would treat virus different. A virus, right?
Right.
Because after studying gun violence, I understand how deep it's rooted, right? But talk to the people who are doing the work around gun violence, figure out what they've come to understand, work with the community who knows their community well, figure out what they feel should be efforts towards addressing the issue, and start someplace.
Right.
And usually in public health we say start where people are at. Where are people? Where are the youth? Let's start with them. If the youth are saying that what they need from a community, from a nation, is just efforts that show that people care about their success, their mobility, and their identity. Mm-hmm. And if we can start there, I think we will make a significant difference. I know that there are other things that we need to do, such as gun control. We know that that's something that needs to be worked on, but the immediate impact and the reasons for the perpetuators of gun violence, we're hearing it stops with youth. So why don't we start there? Mm-hmm. Because we may realize that we may not need to put as much effort towards gun control if we're able to start with our young people, right? They want people, whether it be adults or older youth, to take interest in them, spend time with them, understand what they're going through, and provide some resources, and even sharing their struggles over time. That is the older youth. It helps you to understand that they're not alone. This is what they're telling me, right? And so mentorship is important, especially when families are struggling, because outside of the family we need the resources. We need to be able to build communities of strength where it's not just the families investing in young people. So why is that not happening? That's a very interesting question. Young people, especially youth who have gone through such difficulties in their lives, they become angry. And they take on this persona of I'm a tough guy, and they don't want to engage sometimes with adults. And their initial response when adults want to sort of help them is that they feel suspicious of some of these adults, and they don't want to engage with them until they can trust them. But some adults don't have the patience to be able to wait for that relationship to develop. So they give up on the youth when the youth respond to them sometimes in aggressive ways. But they have to understand that even that aggression comes from somewhere, right? But I think we need to start mentorship early. I understand that at any point in a youth's life, you can make a difference. But I feel that when you start early, and this is why they talk about building the community, because building the community, having a strong community, getting people who have the ability to guide young people and instruct them in positive ways, like your teacher and your neighbor and the older grandmother, that they need to be in a position where they can access the youth and where they can influence the youth. And if we begin with them, then what we will see is that the youth are then influenced earlier in their lives, such that they don't get to a point where they're in their teens and they have access already to a gun. They're carrying a gun. So I think we talk about mediating young people's lives, but we can't wait until they get to that point. Let's start early. But recognizing that even at the point where they've shot somebody, where they've been in prison, that we can reach them. So poverty and racism and police brutality and social depravities, they all contribute to trauma for these youth. And trauma for them, as I talked about in the presentation, becomes the compounding of all of these issues persistently in their lives. And then when they lose family members and friends to gun violence, and they sometimes witness the death of their friends or their family members, that they're re-traumatized. They're re-traumatized with living in certain neighborhoods. They're re-traumatized with negative stereotypes and brutal reactions from people like the police. But we tend to not understand what trauma is for many of these youth. And I often tell people that trauma is different from stress, because trauma, you can have stress and you can get over stress. You can learn to cope. Trauma is long-term, and it's physiological and it's psychological in nature, and it has greater impacts than stress. It shifts their way of thinking. It modifies their way of seeing themselves, seeing the world. They become, as I said, sensitive to anything that they deem as risk, such that every time they lose a friend, every time they see maybe a police officer, a cop in their neighborhood because of their experiences, every time they hear of another shooting in their neighborhood, they become hypersensitive to it. And this trauma over time is so great, and if it's not addressed, right, if it's not resolved with trauma-informed care processes, then it just becomes worse. I see empathy as important in many, many ways, but in particularly to gun violence survivors and youth who are more deprived in terms of their social capacity, agency, that empathy is important to them. Empathy is really about understanding why a person thinks, behaves, acts in the way that they do. And so for young people, we have to ask questions about what would make them pick up a gun and shoot somebody else, and what are the issues within their lives, and how do those issues impact on their actions. And a lot of times we tend to look at criminality as simply a behavior, but it's a behavior that originates from an experience. So what is the experience? And empathy allows us to really start to begin to see people for really who they are, and for the experiences that have been so potent in their lives and in their actions. The youth, talk about systemic empathy. I named it as systemic empathy. And empathy is so important because, as I said, structural issues will not change overnight. So how do we give people the tools to build their resilience so that they can sort of help themselves through while still navigating the social complexities of their lives. And if they feel that there are people within certain systems that understands, if they feel that there are people who understand enough to want to do something about the issue, if they feel that they're not blamed for their circumstances. As I said, when you'd say, we did not cause gun violence, we were born into gun violence. Who else understands it that way?